Right, let's get to it. Hopefully we don't run into too many issues here in our first installment of remote lectures, recorded lectures. Hopefully you guys can hear me out there. Hopefully you guys are doing well, staying healthy, staying sane at home or wherever you are, keeping up with classes. Um, yeah, this is weird. All right. So, where should I start? So today is obviously our first installation of kind of remote lectures, remote discussions, um, and you guys are doing a pretty good job online. The discussion board seems to be going fairly well, so good job there. Just keep in mind that, an ideal discussion question is just that, one that's posed for discussion, one that you guys feel like you could respond to yourselves and really create and craft a good response. Just making it easier on those who are obviously going to have to turn around and reply to those discussion questions, thought-provoking ideas. So it looks like you guys are doing a good job with that so far. Annotated bibliography as well. Looks like most of everybody was able to turn that in there. So hopefully we'll be able to get those back to you with comments. Send you guys comments on Monday. What else? Discussion board. I think that's it. Of course, if you have any questions, send me an email. I'm around. I'm at home, so I'll get back to you. So yeah, so we're jumping off today and talking about political archaeology. When we think of archaeology, politics might not be the first thing that comes to mind, but obviously, you know, as the readings kind of did a good job of introducing us to, archaeology can become a political tool. And I think kind of boils down to this fact that archaeology lends itself to constructing these kind of group identities, social identities that can be extended into the deep past. So kind of joining those two together, these kind of group large identities with kind of this kind of long duration extended past, these identities that do extend into the past, it becomes a really powerful political tool. So we'll look at that today. So our first installment of looking at archaeology and politics. So let's go get into it. So just kind of quick reiteration, you guys might remember the first week or so of class, we thought about what are the reasons that pseudo-archaeology really persists. And I think it's important to reiterate considering we are talking about one of them today, looking at nationalism. We talked about these kind of individual benefits, their benefits that might, or things that might benefit the individual. Think about money, fame. We talked about Piltdown Man, the Cardiff Giant, these examples where individuals are really kind of benefiting off the creation of these false or pseudo archaeologies, right? And then there's kind of another level that we'll be looking at today. These kind of ways that groups can really benefit by creating these false narratives of the past by relying on pseudo archaeology. So again, talking about nationalism today, but you can also look at forms of racism and religion, other forms of group identity, groups of people who really can look to pseudo-archaeology to kind of bolster their claims to a certain religion or form of identity, what have you. Obviously, they're the last one looking at this idea that humans are not perfect, we're emotional, we like to grab onto ideas that are entertaining, exciting, fun. So another reason, obviously, that pseudo-archaeology can persist. But yeah, we'll be looking at nationalism today. So why is that? Why is nationalism, or why is pseudo-archaeology something that can benefit nationalism? What exactly is going on there? So to start, let's cover the basics, right? So what are we talking about? We're talking about nations and nationalism. We think of nations, probably the first thing we think of if we're going to define it is a political body, right? But I think it's important to remember and reiterate here that we're not just talking about politics, we're talking about what essentially boils down to a form of identity. So nations are, at the most basic level, a group of, large group of people who see themselves as similar in terms of, language or customs. These can be religions, dietary practices, stuff like that. But oftentimes language is a huge part of that. and this kind of cultural repertoire that people latch onto to create some sort of shared identity. There's also an aspect of territory. These people share a territory that they control or seek to control. And kind of the third point I wanted to point out here is that although we see nations as real and they exist and they're in a sense kind of rigid, their boundaries seem permanent, they are also, it's important to remember that they're socially constructed in a sense, that they are forms of identity. So this guy named Benedict Anderson in 1983 wrote a book about nationalism, and he called them imagined communities. So what does he exactly mean by that? So he was a political scientist and historian who was looking at this kind of the history of nation building and kind of famously depicted the nation as a socially constructed community, imagined by the people who perceive themselves as part of that group. So something that is, again, socially constructed, right? Not kind of innate, ascriptive, but something that is intentionally kind of created, imagined in a sense. So from that, nationalism is kind of the, let's see if I can get this, there we go. The form of identity which ensues this all-embracing sense of groups, identity, group cohesion that comes about, and from that is this loyalty to the nation, often to what is thought of as a homeland, right, where that nation comes from, where that kind of group originates. And this idea of nationhood and nationalism is often promoted heavily via all forms of mass media, and it often promotes literacy and a comprehensive educational system that focuses, I think, on a shared language. Again, I think language is one of the most common underlying factors that unite these people of nations, and it becomes very real. We can, nations are clearly defined if they have different languages. So that's often intentionally promoted to define a nation as different. And kind of the result of this, nationalism and nation building is a sense of pride that usually leads to prejudice against outsiders, and essentially racism. So this idea or feeling of we inside are inherently different and better, obviously problematic in a sense that it creates these false racist ideas. So essentially nationalism can be boiled down to kind of patriotism on steroids. So the question then comes up, okay, now we talk about nations and nationalism, what does this exactly have to do with archaeology? Well, kind of a roundabout way of talking about the history of archaeology, rather interestingly, this kind of first initial wave of nationalism came about hand in hand with archaeology. So archaeology, in a sense, came into being because of nationalism. So I want to look at that real quick. So some of you might have taken, introduction to archaeology before, or some other classes where you're introduced to the background and history of archaeology. So you might be familiar with this man, Christian Thompson. So Christian Thompson was from Denmark, Denmarkian, I don't know, who in the kind of early 1800s established this chronology for the prehistory of Europe. He divided the prehistory of Europe into 3 stages that you probably are familiar with today, we still use. He divided it into the Stone Age, the Iron Age, and the Bronze Age. So this man, who is considered the grandfather of archaeology in a sense, for coming up with this chronology of prehistoric Europe, can be tied to nationalism in the sense that he was kind of commissioned out of a desire to bolster nationalism within Denmark. So early 19th century was a time of heightened patriotism in Denmark, which this kind of came about as a result of a pretty drastic loss to, I guess, in the Napoleonic Wars. In a sense, they were humiliated. They needed something to kind of bolster morale. So politicians, people with money, looked to archaeology. So the historical kind of calamities that resulted from their loss in the wars encouraged Danes to study their past as a sort of consolidation, I should say, and reassurance to face the future. And so from that, you have the commissioning of Christian Thompson to kind of study the Danish past. And so from that, he actually does this groundbreaking work that extends beyond Denmark into all of Europe. And again, something that we still use today. But we see here a very, very kind of clear example of how archaeology, if we consider someone like Christian Thompson to be the kind of forefather of archaeology, how it came about due to nationalism. And so this wasn't, we're not just seeing this in Denmark, but this is happening in other places at the same time across Europe as well. Other nations were looking to archaeology to create this sense of common identity, one that could be extended into the past as well. So we're seeing here kind of one way of going about using archaeology to make legitimate claims of nations that they are real and that they have kind of been around for a long time. But as we'll kind of see over the next few slides, is that there's a whole lot of ways nations can actually go about using archaeology. It's not really one clear-cut way. Let's go ahead and look into what maybe are these different ways that nations can go about using archaeology. So it's multifaceted, and we'll try and pick apart kind of different strategies that nations can use, different ways they can use archaeology to make legitimate claims. And so there's different strategies, and oftentimes the nations themselves are often using kind of mixed strategies. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to be looking at examples of different countries to kind of exemplify these different strategies, but just know that these are kind of simplistic in the sense that oftentimes it's a whole lot of things going on. They're using archaeology in a lot of ways, but we can look at certain examples as better examples for these individual strategies. So again, similar to the kind of historical example I just alluded to or talked about there with Christian Thompson in Denmark, probably the most common way that nations go about using archaeology to kind of make legitimate claims is that they claim that the conquest or their kind of actions of conquest are really actions of reconquest in a sense, that they're kind of just reclaiming what's already theirs. So if they can essentially make claims that areas were previously held or populated by people who essentially have descendants of the people living within the nation today, then they can rightfully claim that as theirs. So to give kind of a little bit more detail, the archaeological finds are used to demonstrate that a specific area had been settled by a specific ethnic group. Ethnic group is the most clear term here, but we can think of any kind of cultural group. So these were other areas were settled by these ethnic groups in the past, and then that ethnic group and that identity can then be tied to the state. So that's really important, right? So you have to not only clearly show that that group was living in a certain area, but then you have to show that those people belong to your kind of the identity that the nation has created themselves. This usually what is an ethnic identity. So we see examples of this all across the world, all throughout history. So I quickly listed some examples here. Napoleon III was known for kind of having promoted the excavation of sites to kind of craft and create a common ethnic heritage that would help unite a modern France. British are actually known for doing something similar to the Germans. They were kind of who looked to create a pride of their supposed Nordic and Aryan racial affinities. So this goes on in a lot of places, and we'll get into some other examples here in the next few slides. So why is this? So another question that comes up is, why is this really controversial? If people can actually claim that they've descended from people who come from that land, why is that problematic? Well, for a variety of reasons, right? So it's one of the issues that comes up is it's creating these essential claims, these really essential identities in a sense that aren't inherently true. So the example we've already kind of mentioned is the nation itself, and the idea that each individual nation is different than other nations. So it's creating these kind of false boundaries, divisions, that while they might have kind of one foot in reality and truth, are oftentimes and almost always crafted and created in some way that's not entirely reflective of the prehistory, or reality. It's promoting ethnic groups, which in themselves is another form of identity. Um, you know, again, just adding some form of legitimacy to these essentialistic identities, which obviously becomes problematic. You see national conflict, interethnic conflict, what have you, that arises from this. And then also, it just is by the examples we're going to look at. When nations rely on archaeology, they're not doing it in, it's not a scientific way about going and thinking about archaeology or prehistory. It involves almost inevitably some kind of distortion of the past. So other ways, um, kind of, you can think about these as the other strategies we're going to be looking at, the way that nations use archaeology. One follows that it's kind of nations pick and choose parts of their prehistory that they want to use and to kind of craft these national shared identities. So they're capitalizing on certain connections with the past while also kind of ignoring others. Um, the kind of next level of that is using, I think you could probably relate it to pseudo archaeology and creating false histories and narratives. So either just really just misinterpreting the archaeological record or creating false archaeological narratives. In this sense, we're talking about pseudo archaeology, are used to then create some misrepresentation of the past. So those are kind of ways of distorting, manipulating the past kind of archaeology that is there. The final kind of strategy, way of distorting the past, is just kind of completely erasing, and kind of on a whole other level, reinventing the past. So saying, okay, these people didn't exist. It was only our ancestors that have been here. So we'll look at some examples of that too. So, but those basically, in a nutshell, are these different strategies, different ways that nations can distort the past. So we're going to look at ways or examples of each one of these. So we'll start with this most common one. So kind of in my mind, I was quickly brought to examples in South and Central America, where you've got kind of this. I don't know if I have a quick reason, but it's oftentimes you've got pretty prominent prehistoric cultures, and pretty prominent archaeological sites that are capitalized on to kind of construct a modern national identity. So, first example that comes to mind, Mexico. So we'll look at some examples here. We've got the Mexican coat of arms and some currency on the right. So the coat of arms, the story behind this, completely related to an Aztec legend. So modern day Mexico City is located on top of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, the capital and center of the Aztec Empire. So the legend was, according to the Aztecs, that their gods told them to build a city where they spotted an eagle on a cactus eating a serpent. So there you go, right there. They've got that kind of painted out, right? So on the Mexican flag, it sits there in the middle, and you might look at it and just see an eagle, but it's telling a story related to kind of this prehistoric legend of the Aztecs. Obviously, we're there before the Spanish arrived. You see kind of the appropriation of other cultural icons and figures on things like currency. You've got, the last Aztec ruler. You've got a kind of carved relief from, I believe, the Templo Mayor there in the bottom right. So you could think of many, many examples of how these past people, places, prehistoric places, and people are kind of being appropriated, being kind of con in a sense conquested in the sense that the nations, the current nations, are taking ownership over them to build this sense of common identity. Look, we're all Mexican. We all share these prehistoric past as displayed here. Think of other examples beyond Mexico. Peru is another nation that really builds its identity off of the past. So we see that again with the implementation of these symbols on national currencies, right? So Machu Picchu, Corral, two really important Peruvian prehistoric sites there on the currencies. One that I quickly thought of. In Bolivia, you also see kind of the appropriation of prehistoric places. So the image there on the left is of former Bolivian President Evo Morales making a speech at the um, ancient site of Tiwanaku in northern Bolivia there. Again, kind of a different way of claiming these old archaeological sites, taking ownership in a sense to then create a broad, overwhelming sense of identity. And so I think it's important to point out here that it's in places like, okay, let's look at Bolivia. A lot of these people are descendants of the people who created these sites. So why is that, again, why is that really problematic? It's problematic in a sense that it's just the fact that it's making legitimate the nation itself, right? So Tiwanaku has nothing to do with Bolivia as a nation, but they're using that to construct this idea that Bolivia is inherently different from those countries around it because it has this great site of Tiwanaku, etc. So it's using it for political means, and that's obviously, it's not that when these places were created, that was not their original intent. So it's using these symbols in a way that's distorting the past. So moving on to the second strategy, so those first examples are kind of an ownership or appropriation of the past. The second strategy is kind of the distortion of the past. All these, in a sense, can be dwindled down to distorting the past, but distorting the past here in the sense that we're exclusively kind of picking and choosing people and places to represent us as a nation. So the article by Arnold does a really good job of showing how this comes up with Celtic identity and nations across Europe. So those of you who might not be familiar, the Celts are essentially a collection of Indo-European peoples with origins in Central Europe that share similar language, religion, traditions, cultures, what have you, thought to have originated somewhere around modern-day Austria. Let's see if I can point this out here. This yellow area here, somewhere around 12,000 BC. Subsequently kind of spread out across Western Europe into places like Spain, France, Britain, Ireland, and what have you. And so it's interesting in that you see, and so this is what an argument that Arnold points out, is that Celtic identity really takes off in nations, amongst nations that effectively that did not come under the rule of the Roman Empire. So there on the right, you see the extent of Roman rule at its peak. And we'll take a look at some of these places, and this is again coming from Arnold, where Celtic identity really becomes useful in these places where the Romans really never took hold. So she's able to make this argument, and I think she did a really good job here, particularly looking at this table, looking at places, countries, where she finds examples of statues which are commemorating these leaders, these quote-unquote tribal leaders who resisted Roman rule. And so she, kind of gives a basic description of these, when they were built, when the events took place that they're describing, the places, right? So that's really interesting that the countries, the first pattern we seem to see is the countries where these identities are really promoted. And again, these are places where you have the effective people essentially resisted Roman rule. So Belgium, France, Germany, England, examples here. And sure enough, another interesting pattern. These are all used around the same time, right? The mid to late 1800s. So this idea that people are kind of intentionally looking to these past um, people that they don't, it's actually unclear whether they existed. Arnold makes the point that the archaeology of these figures, these events, is actually not very strong. So it's questionable in that sense too. But again, the kind of the broader idea here is that it's, we've got a national identity capitalizing, kind of exclusively capitalizing on these kind of individuals, these Celtic leaders, to then promote a common identity within the boundaries of these nations kind of highlighted here. It's ignoring, again, it's distorting in the sense that it's ignoring, kind of misleadingly, exclusively picking and choosing events from the past that then are then promoted to create this sense of identity. So then the third strategy, moving along, right? So we talked about the conquest of the past, our ownership of the past. In that last slide, looking at distortion of the past. Third strategy is really where pseudo-archaeology comes into play. So in this sense, we're seeing kind of the intentional and complete reinvention of the past. So kind of a complete making up of a completely new narrative. So the example here we'll get into is looking at Nazi Germany, but I think it's important to point out that, while they might be the poster child for this kind of strategy, this happens, again, this is happening in all kinds of places, and it's happened here in the United States as well, where places like, so we have these lots of these mound sites within the kind of eastern U.S. These were kind of interpreted at one time not as the work of Native Americans, but of a race totally unrelated to the kind of present day savages that were living there when these places were kind of first colonized by Europeans. So they weren't made by the Native Americans. They were claimed to have been made by some kind of vanished, kind of more advanced race of the past. So that's kind of similar to in Nazi Germany in the early 20th century. So let's go and talk a little bit about that. So this, if we think about the archaeology in Nazi Germany, it's important to first talk about kind of, trace it all the way back to its roots. Where do these ideas come from? So at the foundation of these ideas is this man, Gustav Cosina, who really kind of laid the foundation to reinventing German prehistory. So Cosina is kind of known for coming up with this idea of what is known as Kulturkreis, which is this central concept of the early 20th century German school of anthropology, really concerned with kind of tracing the roots back of individual societies. And so this is an idea that's closely related to diffusionist approaches of British and American anthropology at the time, but it kind of takes it to a new level, and then it's really focused on tracing individual societies, modern day societies, and tracing them into the past. So essentially, proponents of this school believed that the history of any culture could be reconstructed through the analysis of traits. So here we're talking about artifacts and tracing of the origins of one or more of the original societies. So essentially, by looking at and tracing stylistic similarities in artifacts, we can kind of paint the picture of how societies and therefore nations really developed. So we see here, using these ideas of Cosina, this became a really, really important part of German archaeology and German nation building, leading up to the Second World War, in the sense that anywhere a kind of Germanic artifact could be found was clearly a place where people of German heritage lived at one time, right? So we see that in the image here where we kind of have this center, which is modern day Germany, and kind of this radiating pattern where people kind of past Germans were claimed to have lived based on this idea of uh, Cocina. So obviously there was this idea of racial superiority that was a central tenet of um, construction of the German state, the Nazi state. Um, and so with that, so coming from or kind of developing out of this claims of prehistoric German land holdings across Europe that I just showed, we have the resulting idea that well, so you've got kind of, again, central tenets that Germans were superior and that ancient Germans, again, had settled all across Europe. So from that, kind of the conclusion becomes Germans therefore are justified to conquer and eliminate other territories and their people. They essentially have rights to take back what was theirs originally, right? So the piece by Arnold focuses a little bit on some of these central leaders within the Nazi realm, within the Nazi Party, who kind of pushed these ideas and took them to the next level, right? So we've got Alfred Rosenberg here to the left, and Heinrich Himmler to the right. Again, just two central figures who really focused on, in various ways actually, the kind of uncovering the prehistoric past of Germany. They were really fascinated by it, and they kind of, again, took it to a new level and incorporated it. They were really interested in creating these kind of new neo-pagan, non-Christian religions, and they used archaeology in a way that, again, kind of added legitimacy to these new institutions and beliefs, and their, entirely quacky forms that we'll see. Apparently Rosenberg believed that the Nordic Aryans originated on a last landmass identified with Atlantis. So there's some really quirky ideas here. Himmler, as we're going to see in a bit, and as the Arnold piece goes into, had these kind of wild and outlandish ideas of how this neo-pagan religion really could take off. And we'll see how that's related to archaeology. It is kind of important and really interesting as well. I think that although these figures, and I think this is just kind of a good example for the Nazi Party in general, although these figures were both interested in kind of uncovering a greater German prehistory, the ways that they were going about it were almost entirely different. They were interested, although they were, again, seemed to have a common goal, the kind of methods and the particulars of what they were actually interested in doing seemed different. And it was actually reported that Rosenberg and Himmler were apparently ridiculed by Hitler and his inner circle as a quote-unquote crackpot otherworld apostles who formulated homemade Germanic myths. So that's coming from another article by Arnold, an early article by Arnold. So it just goes to show that although these figures such as those we're looking at here are well known for creating, or kind of notorious for creating this, what we see as a coherent Nazi kind of recreation of the past, it seems to have been much more disjointed and kind of disorganized in a sense. But so let's look at some examples of how this kind of took off. And again, I think it's what we're really interested in here and looking at is how archaeology was not only kind of generally used to make legitimate the state, but how it was related to religion as well. I forgot I had a last point there. Again, so as I mentioned before, just really quickly, I'll wrap this slide up, that oftentimes nations are not just using one strategy of kind of using the past to create their sense of identity. And so although we're looking at Germany for the use of kind of pseudo archaeology to totally create this new narrative, definitely falling victim for all kind of, all three of the different strategies we looked at, right? They're inventing German presence where it's not found, so they're inventing the past. They're suppressing the existence of or kind of evidence of other cultures. They're distorting sites by picking and choosing, where they're looking, when they're looking, what they're finding in a sense. So although again we're focusing on kind of the total kind of reinvention of the past, we will see that they're victim of all these strategies. So where does kind of archaeology really come into nation building and again looking at religion here? So the first example we wanted to look at, or we're going to look at, is the Externstein, which is, this beautiful site in central Germany. And in popular tradition, the site, the Externstein, was identified as a sacred site of the pagan Saxons. So the Saxons were a member of a Germanic tribe that inhabited parts of central and northern Germany from Roman times. And so this place was identified as a location of a really important idol of these pagan Saxons, which I do not know how to pronounce, but it was essentially the great sacred pillar of these pagan Saxons. And it comes into kind of the Nazi propaganda. It's thought that Charlemagne, who was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in AD 800, waged battles against these pagan Saxons within Germany, and is reputed to have kind of destroyed the most important ritual site of the Saxons, this place of this central pillar idol. So it's thought that Charlemagne destroyed it. So from this, you get this kind of propaganda that demonizes Charlemagne as Karl the Saxon Slaughterer. And so Germans kind of became interested in looking into this past religion when they're, again, trying to create this non-Christian new religion that their state could really thrive off of. They kind of focused on these pagan Saxons. So Herman Wirth, who is I believe a Dutch archaeologist, was convinced that the site that was destroyed by Charlemagne, so the site with the central pillar idol, was identical to what we're seeing at the Externstein. And so Himmler actually assigned him to conduct excavations at the site, where he, of course, unsurprisingly discovered, that it had been used during the period in question, and it was used as a solar observatory of some site. He interpreted kind of enigmatic graffiti on the walls of this site as some form of runes or letters of an ancient German alphabet related to the solstices. So the site was eventually selected by National Socialists as a spiritual center, based on these excavations, as the spiritual center of the Germanic world. As it turns out, Arnold argues, there's actually no really concrete evidence that the site was ever used by these pagan Saxons during this, quote-unquote relevant period that they're really interested in. So although it was eventually used as this kind of symbolic center of this neo-pagan religion, entirely based on false claims of archaeology and prehistory. So we see a similar example at the second site we're going to look at. So the Heidelberg Thingstatt, which we see here. So this was constructed under the Third Reich to commemorate a supposed ancient German shrine. And again, as I already mentioned, although they're building this in a place which was supposed to have had some connection with this pagan past, again, Arnold is saying it's no concrete evidence that that is actually going on. So this Heidelberg Thingstatt is, as you can see here, it's basically an open air theater. It's a place. Well, I'll just say that Himmler kind of recognized that in creating this, new society, this new nation, they would need a new kind of religious or belief system. So again, the question is, what are we going to do to replace the Christian faith? So he recognized the kind of power of capitalizing off of these ancient prehistoric practices, and so he came up with this idea of creating these open air theaters where evidence of past um, Germanic or pagan cultures existed. And so in these places, they would build these open air theaters where um, people could come together and participate in essentially what is kind of a cult-like following in a sense. So again, the irony here is that places like this, so the Heidelberg things that was supposed to have been kind of literally built on top of these ancient sites, these Germanic sites. The irony here is that there was no concrete evidence that there was actually remains dating to that cultural period. As Arnold points out, there's actually at this site in particular, there's things relating to the earlier times, bronze, I think the Bronze and Iron Age, in particular, even maybe even Neolithic as well, but there in fact was nothing relating to the kind of cultural practice that they were interested in. So and then I kind of mentioned the kind of alternative strategy. So if you're not going to capitalize off the past, if you're not going to use the past in some sense, what kind of other option do you have? And essentially, it's a kind of dismissal, ignorance, or kind of erasure of the past. And we actually see this in places like the United States, where our current nation does not use the archaeology found, kind of the prehistoric remains found within our boundaries, to create a shared sense of identity. In a sense, it's just completely forgetting about the previous people who had lived here. And in thinking about this example, just thought of this image, which kind of is based on this idea of manifest destiny, that Americans were destined by God to take over the entirety of kind of the continental U.S., right, from the eastern portion to the west, as depicted here. And it's interesting that we have depiction of the Native Americans kind of being led away in a sense. So although we do have, right, we obviously have examples of prehistoric peoples and places within our country where we stand unique in the sense that we did not try to capitalize off of it. Instead, we just attempted to totally kind of erase it from our kind of nation's history. So in the end, what are the kind of takeaway points? What are the repercussions and conclusions to take away from this? What we've seen here, the fact that nations often do, to some extent, rely on archaeology. I think maybe the most particular point is that, well, German archaeology, as was shown by Arnold, since it was so problematic, it was one which was based on kind of reinventing the past, kind of really suffered, had a hard time kind of gaining strength once things changed there. But in a more general sense, archaeology as well has kind of had to deal with these things. Thinking about the historical development of archaeology, the fact that it was so tightly tied to these construction of nations, which we understand today. Again, thinking about this ideas of Benedict Anderson, that nations are these imagined communities, kind of in a sense, falsely constructed. Archaeology has kind of had to deal with um, how to kind of reposition itself as a legitimate enterprise, and one that is not so easily kind of persuaded by ongoing political events and what have you. One that can be a rigorous kind of scientific endeavor. All right, I think that does it for today.